Florence's voice trembled as she tried to speak, her words catching before they finally slipped out in a stutter. I'm ready. Maxwell Hayes froze, blinking at her as though she'd just spoken in a language he didn't understand. Wait, hold on. You actually want to do this? He asked, his brows knitting in disbelief. Since when? I didn't even ask you properly the first time, and you practically bit my head off. She folded her arms, giving him that sharp, knowing look that made him feel about 2 feet tall. Well, I'm saying it now. Take it or leave it. He stared for a beat longer, utterly floored. His pride taking a small hit but his heart swelling all the same. The weight of what she had just offered, the one thing that would finally make him whole, hit him all at once. Without thinking, Maxwell stepped forward, scooped her into his arms, and held her so tightly her feet left the ground. Max, she started, but he was already laughing under his breath, a shaky, disbelieving sound that came out almost like a sob. Then he set her down abruptly, still holding her shoulders as he blurted, I'm sorry for doing that. God, I'm so happy right now. His grin was boyish, unguarded, almost foolish, but it was the kind of happiness that left no room for shame. Florence just shook her head at him, but there was a softness in her eyes now, one that told him she understood. And in that moment, even with all the chaos waiting outside, Maxwell felt like the world had just fallen perfectly into place. That evening felt different from the very start. Florence had not expected to find a small white box waiting on her bed, wrapped in a satin ribbon with a folded note resting on top. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, unfolding the paper to see Maxwell Hayes' handwriting. Strong, deliberate, and yet softer than she'd ever seen it. Thank you for giving me this chance, for trusting me with something I don't deserve, but will guard with my life. This is more than I can ever repay. Tonight, I just want to honor you and us. By the time she finished reading, her eyes were wet. She wiped them quickly, but the tears kept coming, spilling freely as her gaze drifted to the small necklace hanging from her palm. It was the one she kept hidden away, with the miniature photograph of her late husband locked inside. She pressed it to her lips, whispering words only he could hear. You told me to live again. I think I'm finally ready. When she opened the box, her breath caught. It was lingerie, delicate lace the color of deep ocean blue, the very shade Maxwell once casually told her was his favorite. She'd never imagined herself in something like this, but tonight, it wasn't about daring or shame. It was about him. Her hands shook slightly as she dressed, feeling the smooth fabric cling and shape to her. She caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. For a long time she simply stood there, breathing, holding her necklace in one hand like an anchor. The bedroom she stepped into next was one she never entered on ordinary days. It had always felt too large, too polished, too his. But now, bathed in soft amber light, it looked transformed, warm and inviting, with candles flickering in crystal holders, their glow dancing across the walls. Rose petals traced a path toward the bed, and a faint melody played somewhere in the background, so low it was almost part of the silence. Maxwell was waiting. He didn't just look at her. He took her in, his expression caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. He reached for her hand, his palm warm and steady against her trembling fingers, and walked with her into the heart of the room. A chilled bottle of wine rested in a silver bucket near the bed, the kind she had only ever seen in passing at high-end shops she couldn't afford to enter. He poured it into tall, delicate glasses, the dark red liquid catching the candlelight. Most people only drink this once in their lives, he murmured, handing her a glass. Tonight, you deserve it. She sipped, the taste rich and strange, a little too much for her tongue but perfect for the moment. His eyes never left her, even as he set both glasses aside and pulled her closer, his breath warm against her temple. The first kiss was gentle, almost testing, like he was asking for permission with his lips. She leaned in, answering him without words. He whispered against her mouth, promises spilling out, about loving her, about protecting her, about their child. Thank you for doing this, for trusting me, he said softly, and she felt his sincerity press into every syllable. When his hands traced her back, she shivered. The heat between them built slowly, each kiss deepening, his touch careful but certain. She hadn't meant for this night to be about surrender, not in the physical sense. She thought it would just be about trust, about being close. But somewhere between his words and his tenderness, she realized she wanted this, even with the fear. She was still a virgin, and when the moment came, it hurt. Sharp at first, enough to make her gasp. But his hands stayed on her, holding her in place, grounding her. He kissed her temple, murmuring, "I've got you. I'll go slow." And he did. The rhythm was patient, almost reverent, each movement laced with care. The pain slowly gave way to a warmth she hadn't expected, a kind of pleasure that crept in softly until she was no longer bracing against it but moving with him, meeting him. Her breath grew unsteady, soft moans slipping free without her meaning to. Maxwell's eyes never left hers, not even when his own breath grew heavy. "You're everything," he whispered, his voice breaking. She could feel his heart hammering against her as he held her like she was something rare, something he could never afford to lose. When they finally stilled, his forehead rested against hers, their breaths tangled, hearts pounding in unison. He smiled faintly through the moisture in his eyes, brushing his thumb along her cheek. "If I had nothing else in this life but you and our child, it would be enough." In that candlelit room, with the scent of wine still in the air and their bodies wrapped around each other, Florence knew she had just given a piece of herself she could never take back, and she was glad it was to him. The first rays of morning slipped quietly through the curtains, painting faint gold patterns across the room. Florence stirred, her body still curled in the warmth of Maxwell Hayes beside her. The air was calm, almost fragile, as if it carried the weight of what had passed between them the night before. She didn't move at first, partly because her body still ached in unfamiliar ways, partly because she wanted to hold on to the feeling of being there, in that moment, just a little longer. Maxwell was already awake, his head turned toward her, eyes fixed on her face with an expression that was both tender and unguarded. For a while, he didn't speak. Instead, he leaned forward, brushing his lips against hers in a slow, deliberate kiss, light at first, as though still asking if it was welcome. When she didn't draw away, his hand came up to cradle her cheek and the kiss deepened, unhurried, carrying a quiet heat that made her breath quicken. Her chest rose sharply, but it wasn't fear she felt this time. It was something softer, heavier, a sense of belonging she hadn't been prepared for. When he pulled back, their foreheads lingered close, his breath warm against her skin. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice low and still colored by sleep. He smiled faintly, fingers tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I like hearing that," he said, not in jest but with a kind of quiet relief, as if the simple exchange meant more to him than she could understand. "After last night, I don't want distance between us." Florence hesitated. Keeping a certain formality had always been a shield, her way of keeping her heart safe, but as he pulled her against his chest, his arms closing around her in a steady hold, the wall she was used to holding up felt less necessary. She rested her palm lightly against his chest, feeling the strong, steady rhythm beneath. "Good morning, Maxwell," she said at last, and his smile deepened, not out of amusement, but with gratitude, as though she had given him something rare. They stayed like that for a while, tangled in the quiet cocoon of blankets, her head nestled against him while his fingers traced slow, absent circles along her arm. The silence between them wasn't hollow. It was alive, filled with the unspoken memory of the night, with fragile hopes neither of them dared put into words yet. After some time, his voice broke the stillness. "Now we wait," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself, "and hope that last night gave us more than just something to remember." She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. "And if it didn't?" Maxwell's hand moved to her chin, tilting her face up so there was no distance between their eyes. His voice was steady, certain. "Then we try again, not because we have to, but because you want to. Only when you're ready." There was no pressure in his tone, only patience and an assurance that settled deep in her chest. She let out a slow breath and tucked herself closer to him, allowing his warmth to wrap around her until the uncertainty in her mind felt smaller. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't bracing for loss or disappointment. She felt herself stepping, not toward the edge of something frightening, but into the quiet beginning of something new. In the weeks that followed, Maxwell Hayes' health began to change. Not in a sharp, dramatic collapse, but in the quiet way a candle burns lower without anyone noticing until the flame flickers. It started with little things. A cough that lingered too long, a falter in his step, the faintest hesitation before drawing a breath. Florence saw every sign, even when he tried to brush them aside with a gentle laugh or the small, charming grin that once carried the authority to silence a room. Now, even that smile seemed dimmed, shadowed by a fatigue that settled deep in his bones. Yet for all the strain, he refused to withdraw from her. If anything, he clung closer. He called her to join him in the garden on cool afternoons, even when his fingers trembled so badly he could barely lift his cup. He would ask her to read to him, though his eyes often stayed closed, not because he wasn't listening, but because he was letting the sound of her voice fill the spaces that pain had carved inside him. And sometimes, without saying anything at all, he would take her hand, press a slow kiss to her knuckles, and rest it over his heart as though her touch was the only thread keeping him tied to the present. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the sky turned the color of fire spilling into water, he reached for her with a request that made her pause. "Come sit with me." "Like before," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. She hesitated, taking in the frailty of his frame, the pale stretch of skin across his cheekbones, the way his shoulders no longer carried their old strength. But his gaze was steady, waiting, and she could not deny him. Carefully, she eased herself into his lap, curling her arms around his shoulders, feeling how much lighter he'd become. His lips found hers, no longer with the confident hunger she remembered, but with a slow, aching need, as if he were committing every detail of her to memory. His breath was thin, his chest rising with effort, but his heart still beat with the same fierce devotion. "You smell like hope," he whispered against her neck. The words were almost weightless, yet they struck deep, and she smiled through the sting in her eyes. She held him tighter, wanting to keep him there, to hold the moment in place. But the very next morning, everything changed. She found him crumpled on the floor beside the bed, his body twisted awkwardly as though he had tried to stand and failed. A thin streak of crimson smeared across the white tiles marked where he must have coughed during the night. For one frozen heartbeat, she couldn't move. Then panic crashed over her in a wave. "Maxwell!" Her voice tore from her throat, raw and desperate, as she dropped to her knees beside him. His skin felt cold beneath her shaking fingers. She shouted for help until the sound scraped her lungs. Footsteps thundered down the hallway, and within moments, strangers in crisp uniforms were lifting him onto a stretcher. The ride to the hospital blurred into fragments. The sharp scent of antiseptic, the shrill squeak of wheels, the hollow thud of her own pulse in her ears. By the time they reached the emergency ward, Maxwell was still and unresponsive, his breath so shallow they barely stirred his chest. Machines came alive around him in a chorus of beeps and low hums. Tubes slid into place, nurses moved quickly, doctors murmured instructions she could barely follow. None of it made him open his eyes. Florence took a chair by his side and stayed there, her fingers curled around his limp hand, willing warmth back into it. This was the man whose presence had once filled every room with certainty, whose voice could command attention without effort. And now he lay silent, reduced to fragile breaths and the sound of machinery keeping time for him. She leaned close, whispering his name again and again, as though repetition could pull him back. It was then, in the middle of that heavy stillness, that a different awareness crept into her. A faint unease in her body she had been ignoring for days, a lateness that could no longer be dismissed. Her head swam, her stomach nodded. With trembling resolve, she slipped out long enough to buy a small box from the pharmacy. Her hands shook so badly she could hardly tear it open. Minutes later, she stared down at two unyielding pink lines, bold and certain. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, the test clutched against her chest. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, the words breaking on her lips. Her palm slid protectively over her abdomen. "Maxwell, you're going to be a father." When she returned to his room, she still had the test in her hand. She sank back into the chair, tears clouding her vision. Reaching forward, she brushed his hair gently from his forehead. Her voice quivered as she spoke, more prayer than conversation. "Please, just open your eyes once. I can't do this without you. Our baby can't lose you before they even arrive." She guided his hand to rest against her stomach, pressing it there as though he could feel the life stirring inside her. "You're still here," she breathed. "And so is your legacy." Days blurred together. She refused to leave, curling herself against his still form on the narrow hospital bed, listening to the steady rhythm of the machines that kept him breathing. Nurses whispered about her devotion, about the way she spoke to him as if he could hear, about the nights she sang softly into the darkness. To her, he was not gone, just lost somewhere deep, searching for a way back. That night, rain whispered against the hospital window. She lay beside him, one hand resting over his, her lips moving in quiet prayers for strength. She hummed lullabies to the child within her, then turned to murmur confessions into Maxwell's ear, just in case his soul was lingering close enough to listen. And then something shifted, a faint tightening of his fingers against her palm. The air seemed to change, charged with something fragile. "Florence." Her eyes flew open, her heart stumbling. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, until it came again, softer, broken but real. "You stayed." Her breath caught. She pushed herself up, staring into the faint glimmer of awareness in his half-lidded eyes. "Maxwell." "Oh my God, Maxwell, you're awake." Her hands framed his face, afraid that if she let go, he might slip away again. "I missed you," he rasped, his fingertips brushing her wrist in a ghost of his old touch. A sob broke free from her chest as she pressed her forehead to his. "Don't you ever do that to me again. Do you understand?" "I tried to come back," he whispered. "The doctors called it a miracle." Within days, his color returned, the machines were removed, and though he was still weak, his eyes stayed open and focused on her. When the day came for him to leave, Florence held his hand like a lifeline. The world outside the hospital seemed brighter, the air fresher, the sunlight almost too much to take in after weeks of sterile walls. As the car rolled away, Maxwell turned to her, not with the look of a man returning from illness, but as someone seeing the person he loved for the very first time. That night back at the mansion, she helped him into bed, fluffing the pillows just right. He reached for her wrist, gently pulling her down beside him. "I have something to tell you," she whispered. He turned to her, eyes full of wonder. "What is it?" She took his hand and guided it slowly to her stomach. "We're having a baby." He froze, and then his eyes brimmed with tears. "You're serious?" She nodded, laughing through her tears. "You're going to be a father." Maxwell pulled her into his arms as strong as his body would allow and kissed her. Slow, reverent, overflowing with everything words couldn't say. "Thank you," he whispered, his lips brushing hers. "You've given me everything I never thought I'd have." They lay together in the quiet, wrapped in each other's arms, her hand in his cheek against her temple. There were no machines, no sterile lights, no ticking clocks, just warmth, just love. "I'll be here," he promised, his voice soft and sure. "For you, for our baby, for however long I'm given." And in the glow of that night they kissed again, not with urgency but with love deep and pure. It wasn't about duty, it wasn't about time running out, it was about finding forever in the time they had left. It had been weeks since Florence's quiet vow, her promise to keep Maxwell grounded in this world no matter how much time he had left. And every day she watched him closely, silently counting moments, cherishing breaths. The doctors had said 6 months. Now the 5th month was drawing thin, and both of them felt the pressure of that number like a shadow at the edge of every room. Maxwell remained. Weaker, yes, but still holding her hand, still smiling through pain, still present in a way that felt almost impossible and therefore precious beyond measure. On a humid morning painted with hope and nerves, they found themselves back in the hospital, seated in a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. Florence lay on the examination table, her belly gently rounded, her fingers laced with his. His grip was steady, but she could feel the tension in his touch, the weight of anticipation in every breath he took. The doctor entered with a kind smile, rolling over the ultrasound machine. "Let's take a look, shall we?" she said, gently applying the cool gel across Florence's skin. The room held its breath as the probe touched her belly, and moments later the rhythmic pulsing of heartbeats filled the space. But something was different, louder, double. Florence furrowed her brow. "Doctor, is that?" "Yes," the doctor said with a beam. "2 heartbeats. You're expecting twins." Silence struck for a beat before Maxwell gasped. "Twins?" His voice trembled, barely more than air. His hand flew to his mouth in shock, then dropped to gently stroke Florence's belly, as though he could feel both lives awakening beneath her skin. Florence turned her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "2 boys," the doctor added softly. "Strong, healthy boys." Maxwell let out a shaky half-laugh, half-sob, running a trembling hand over his face. "2 sons, Florence. Do you know what this means?" She reached for him, her voice full of awe. "It means we're blessed." He exhaled the emotion, too thick to speak. For a man who had begged for just enough time to meet 1 child, this was beyond anything he had dared hope for. "I asked God for 1 miracle, and he gave me 2, he whispered, voice cracking with gratitude. The doctor smiled warmly. "You're almost there, just 1 month left," she said, then paused as her expression softened. She lowered her voice, not to alarm but to be honest. "Maxwell, we must also be realistic about your condition. The underlying disease hasn't changed, and while every case is unique, you need to understand the risks and prepare accordingly." The calm clarity of her words landed like a cold wind. Maxwell's shoulders sagged as if the breath had been knocked out of him. The color drained from his face and his fingers faltered on Florence's hand. He looked suddenly small in the bright exam room, the weight of the doctor's timeline pressing into him with a force that left him reeling. He tried to breathe, tried to steady himself, but his legs betrayed him and he sank back into the chair, a stunned, raw silence stretching between them. Florence felt panic rise, quick and hot, but she forced it down so she could be steady for him. She leaned forward, cupping his cheek gently so he would meet her eyes. "Don't do that," she said, holding his gaze firmly, voice low but fierce. "Don't let their words steal what God has already given us. You haven't reached that final day yet, Maxwell, and I'm not going to let fear take the shape of truth for us." He blinked at her, the tremor in his hands slowing as her certainty warmed him. "What if?" he began, the question breaking on his lips. "Then we fight," she answered before he could finish, and there was no doubt in her tone. "We fight for every hour, every breath. I'll be with you in the hospital room and at home when you can be home. I'll keep you tethered, I'll bring you doctors, I'll bring you prayer, I'll bring whatever we need. And you won't go quietly. We'll make sure those boys know their father, your voice, your stories, your laugh. You will be here to meet them. I promise you that." Her words wrapped around him like a steadied current, and for a moment he let himself lean into that promise, drawing strength from the certainty in her voice. He placed his hand over hers on her belly, feeling the faint movement beneath his palm, and the fear receded enough to let gratitude in. When they left the hospital, hand in hand, the light outside seemed almost too bright after the fluorescent hush inside. Maxwell looked up at the sky as if measuring it, and though he said nothing, his eyes shone with a complicated mix of gratitude and resolve. Florence leaned gently into him, anchoring him to this miracle of a moment. 2 lives growing inside her, 2 reasons to keep fighting, and a single month that they'd refused to allow to be a sentence rather than a challenge. They walked slowly back to the car, each step measured, each breath deliberate, and though neither could guess all that lay ahead, both understood the work they would do, together, between now and the day their sons were born. The first contraction came like a sharp bolt of lightning that stole Florence's breath. She froze mid-step in the small kitchen, one hand gripping the counter, the other pressed instinctively to her swollen belly. For weeks, she had been preparing for this moment, telling herself she would be calm when the time came, but the suddenness of it sent a jolt of panic through her chest. "Maxwell," she called, her voice tight. From the living room, Maxwell looked up from the crib he had been assembling. He had been moving slowly, the pain in his body a quiet, constant shadow he had learned to hide from her. But at the sound of her voice, all weariness vanished. In 2 strides he was beside her, his hands hovering near her arms as if afraid to hurt her but desperate to help. "Is it?" he started. She nodded, biting back a cry as another contraction tore through her. "It's time." The world seemed to blur into motion. Maxwell grabbed the hospital bag they had packed weeks earlier, his heart pounding, not just with urgency but with the deep awareness that this moment, this journey to meet their children, was one he might never make again. Every step felt heavy with meaning. By the time they reached the car, Florence was breathing through clenched teeth, sweat already dampening her forehead. Maxwell opened the door for her, easing her into the seat with a gentleness that masked the tremor in his hands. His chest ached, his vision swam briefly, but he pushed it aside. Not now. She needed him strong. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Streetlights flashed over them, the hum of the tires blending with Florence's shallow breaths. He kept one hand on the wheel and the other gripping hers, squeezing in silent reassurance. At the hospital entrance, nurses rushed to meet them, guiding Florence onto a wheelchair. Maxwell stayed close, his tall frame bent protectively over her as they wheeled her through bright corridors. Every now and then she'd glance at him, and though his face was pale, his eyes were steady, carrying the weight of a man who had promised to fight for this moment, and was keeping that promise. In the delivery room, time lost all meaning. The hours blurred into an exhausting rhythm of pain, encouragement, and whispered prayers. Maxwell never left her side. He wiped her forehead with a cool cloth, murmured her name like an anchor, and let her crush his hand with each contraction. His own pain gnawed at him, a reminder of the ticking clock inside his body. But looking at her, fighting, enduring, bringing their children into the world, he felt an almost defiant surge of life. The hospital room was warm but still, the quiet broken only by the gentle coos of 2 tiny infants swaddled in pale blue blankets. Florence sat propped up against a mound of pillows, her arms curved protectively around her sons, the living proof that miracles sometimes came in pairs. She could not stop staring at their faces, so small, so fragile, yet wearing the faintest echoes of Maxwell Hayes in the curve of their chins and the faint arch of their brows. Every breath they took was like a note in a song she never wanted to end. Maxwell stood a few feet away at first, almost frozen, as though stepping closer might shatter the scene and wake him from what surely had to be a dream. The man who had fought battles with hospitals, sleepless nights, and pain no one could see now found himself staring at something he never thought he'd touch. His future, wrapped in soft cotton and the scent of newborn skin. He moved forward with deliberate care, his broad hands trembling as they reached for the first child. The moment the baby was nestled against his chest, Maxwell's head bowed instinctively, his lips pressing a kiss so gentle it barely stirred the boy's hair. His breathing grew uneven, but not from illness, from awe. His eyes, glossy with unshed tears, flicked to Florence as if asking silently, "Is this real? Did we truly make it here?" Florence smiled through her own tears, reaching out to lay a steadying hand on his arm. "You made it, Max," she said softly, her voice breaking. "You fought, and you made it." When he took the second child into his other arm, he held both close as though his embrace alone could shield them from the world. The weight was nothing compared to the years he had carried hope on his shoulders. He sat at the edge of her bed, the 3 of them forming a quiet circle that felt outside the reach of time. But the moment's perfection trembled when the door opened and the doctor stepped inside, clipboard in hand. The usual hospital smile was missing, replaced by the kind of steady, measured expression that doctors wore when they had to be both healer and truth-teller. Maxwell, the doctor began, his voice low. I need to remind you, based on your scans and progression, you still have about 4 weeks. We'll do everything we can to make them comfortable for you. The words hit like a blow to the chest. Maxwell's grip on his sons did not loosen, but his eyes dropped, his shoulders sinking under an invisible weight. For months, he had measured time like a candle burning low. Now the wick was frighteningly short. The thought that he might not be there to watch his sons' first steps, hear their first words, or guide them through life made his stomach twist with a pain no medicine could dull. Florence, seeing the flicker of fear in his gaze, shifted closer. Her voice was steady, though her heart was trembling. Max, listen to me, she whispered, her fingers threading through his. A month is still time. You've fought this long, you can fight for 30 more days. And if the day comes sooner, you'll have given them this moment, this memory, this proof that their father's love existed before they even opened their eyes. He turned to her, searching her face as though trying to borrow her strength. She didn't look away. They will grow up knowing their father was a man who didn't run from the storm, she said, her thumb brushing against his knuckles. You met them, you held them, you loved them. That's more than many children ever get. The rest of the day passed in a strange blend of joy and shadow. Nurses came and went, monitors beeped softly, and sunlight slid slowly across the room. At one point, Maxwell shifted into the armchair by the window, both sons sleeping soundly against him. Florence watched him from the bed, his head tilted slightly forward, a faint smile lingering on his lips, the kind of peace she had rarely seen on his face. She wondered what he was thinking. Was he memorizing the weight of their bodies against his chest? Counting their tiny breaths? She suspected he was, because she was doing the same from where she sat. When the evening came, Florence placed the twins in their bassinet and knelt beside him. Promise me you won't spend these weeks counting down, she said quietly. Promise me you'll live them. He nodded slowly, his eyes on hers. I'll live every second, he murmured, and I'll make sure they see me fight until my last breath. That night, they stayed awake longer than they should have, trading whispered plans for moments they might still have time to create. A walk outside when Florence was discharged, photographs in the park, a small birthday cake for the twins' 1-month mark, even if they were too young to understand. It was a fragile hope, but it was theirs. The lesson that night wasn't one of defeat but of presence. That even when time is short, love can stretch it, widen it, make a month feel like a lifetime if you fill it with meaning.